In this session, we'll be working with a JEditorPane. The way we'll use a JEditorPane would be to display our documentation. Now, the documentation itself is in the form of an HTML document, and that's what's unique about the JEditorPane. It's able to actually render HTML markup to a limited extent, of course. Listeners can be applied to the JEditorPane so that hyperlinks can be clickable, so we can actually make this very interactive. I think it's a really useful feature when developing applications because you'll have an external help resource, for instance, that you can link into your application's documentation option. So let's get started. The first thing that we'll need to do is to prepare a directory. So the changes that we'll need to make with in our deployment directory, or at least our project directory, would be the creation of a docs folder. Now, the docs folder itself will contain our HTML document. So as it stands, the content really doesn't matter. All right, you can throw any content in there, but this is some simple markup for our Java text editor itself. So this must be within the working directory of our project, and it's just an additional custom folder that we'll create here called docs. Now, after this is done, head over to your IDE and open up your JText editor project, and we'll basically pick up where we left off. The first thing that we'll do is we'll create a new class under the JTextEditor.ui package, and our new class will be called HelpDialog. In camel cases, you can see it here. So once you create this class, it'll look something like this, and this will be the foundation of our HelpDialog that you just saw there, that rendered the JEditorPane, which in turn renders our HTML document stored in the docs folder within our project directory. So one of the first things that we'll need to do is to make our help dialog into a frame of its own right. Okay, so we'll extend JFrame for that. And since we'll be working with the JEditorPane, which in turn needs to be fed a resource, an external resource, we'll actually be working with the URL class. And the URL class is really useful for working with any URLs, whether it's file-based URLs or otherwise, so that we can actually build a path dynamically to a particular resource that should be loaded. And the JEditorPane is designed as such whereby we can actually load it with an actual URL object that represents a particular path to a resource. So we're going to design our help dialog to, first of all, have an instance of a JEditorPane inside of it wrapped in a scroll pane, and then feed it a URL that points to our help documentation inside of the docs folder. So first we'll actually create an attribute, call it resource URL, which is basically a URL type resource indicator to a particular HTML docs. Right now we're going to initialize it to null, but later on in the constructor you'll see that we're going to fill it with information, instantiate the actual URL object, and provide a file-based path to our help document. So because we're using URLs, you'll find that we have to abide by the way that the URL class is designed. So there are a couple of exceptions that must be either caught or thrown. So in this case, since we're working with a help dialog that works in conjunction with our main UI, we want to throw those exceptions back to the UI rather than handle them in our help dialog itself. So this is why we're opting to throw in the constructor of our class here. So that means that whenever the main UI instantiates our help dialog, it must put in the try-catch mechanism, the exception handling mechanism, to determine whether the help file itself was found or not. So in this case, the first exception is a malformed URL exception, just in case the URL does not fit the particular standard in terms of its format. And the second is an IO exception, just in case the URL is well formed, but the resource doesn't exist. So these are the two exceptions that we're throwing back to our main UI so that we can handle the particular scenario safely in one place. So within here, one of the first things that we'll do is we'll start instantiating our EditorPane instance, and this is the actual type of text pane that will be rendering our HTML document. The EditorPane can be compared as one of those other text components, just like the JText area and the JText pane, but the EditorPane's speciality is being able to handle other file formats such as rich text files and HTML files. So the EditorPane in this case is particularly useful in that regard. Even though it can handle regular text, it's capable of loading these formatting kits that are able to read certain types of formats and markups and so forth, HTML being one of them. The accompanying lecture should give you more information about the JEditorPane. So in this particular case, we're using it to render our HTML help doc. So what we're going to do next is that we're going to instantiate our URL class with a dynamically constructed path to our help documentation. Now the reason why the path needs to be dynamically constructed is because when we package our actual JText Java text editor and we deploy it, let's say we give others to use it, and they'll have to install it on their own local machines. And in that regard, we'll need to have the path dynamically constructed every single time, because we can't necessarily predict everyone's possible directory configuration. So this is why we're going to use this particular approach to ensure that the help file is always found regardless of its particular location. All right. So here is where we reference our global resource URL attribute here. And we're going to instantiate a new URL, but we're going to begin with a file-based URL. So it begins with file : all right, instead of HTTP : etc. Now this is where the dynamic bits start. So we use the system.get property to start by mapping out the current directory, or the user.dir itself will map out the current working directory of the application, followed by a file separator. Now these separators, we can put a slash in, but in different operating systems the separators are different. For instance, in the Windows-based operating systems, the separators are backslashes leaning towards the left. In the Unix-based operating systems, the separations are forward slashes leaning towards the right. We want to make sure, because Java is cross-platform, we want to make sure that we use the correct separator regardless of the operating system. So further to that, we're going to put our subdirectory docs, like I showed you in the deployment directory. There was a docs folder that you were supposed to create, and within the docs folder there is our HTML document. So we're going to add another separator here, file.separator, and we're going to put the name of our HTML document. Make sure you have the name here correspond to the name inside of your docs folder, so that it's actually going to find the right file. And this is basically all it takes. So right now we've constructed a well-formed URL, a file-based URL, to our path, to our particular document, our help file. And once we feed this to our JEditorPane, it should be able to pull the file up, read it, and render it as HTML. Now the JEditorPane understands this automatically because it understands what files needs to be read, particularly by the extension, for instance. And it's able to load the correct kit to render the particular file in question. Alright, so the next thing that we do is we want to make sure that the user doesn't edit the rendered document. By default, if we don't set editable to false, the user will actually be able to edit that rendered HTML in place. So to prevent that, we'll just set editable to false. And here is where we actually give it the resource URL that we've constructed earlier. Alright, the next thing that we do is we add our JEditorPane to the frame itself. But before we do that, we want to wrap it into a scroll pane, because the content itself obviously would exceed the viewable region of the frame, so a scroll pane will be ideal. We typically always do that. and this is where we instantiate our JScrollPane, and you'll notice inside of the constructed JScrollPane, as we typically used it before, is our EditorPane instance. Okay, and then we want to set a few constraints to our EditorPane. So we want to make sure that, okay, well, you know, we can just show the vertical scroll bars always, regardless of whether the content scrolls or not. You can leave this out. It's not particularly important. It's just to sort of express what else you can do with respect to the scroll pane itself. All right, and we can also set a preferred size of our scroll pane. So again, these are just to express all of the various other things that we can do to set constraints and to refine the presentation of our particular component, the JScrollPane. All right, and here is where we add it to our frame. So right now it will be added to our frame, but our frame will be visible, obviously, because it's not initialized. The set visible isn't set there, and we're actually going to ignore the set visible, and you'll see why in a bit. So you'll see here that we would typically say set visible to true, but we're not going to do that just yet, because this particular help dialog will work in conjunction with our main UI, and it won't always be shown. So you'll see how we set this up later on. So what we do though is we set a particular size, so it's going to be about 500 by 500 on the editor pane itself, and the size of the window itself will be 520 by 540. Okay, and then we say set resizable to false. So we want to make our help dialog fixed in size, so the user can't, you know, maximize or minimize the particular window. It's just a choice, just to keep the I guess just to keep the content you know, in a particular visible fashion, I guess. But again, you can take this out if you wish, depending on the way that your help is designed. All right, and now here's where we need some utility methods to work in conjunction with our main UI. The first method will, as the name suggests, show the window. Now, when this particular class is instantiated, it exists, but it's not visible. Now, we'd like to trigger the frame itself that we're building here whenever the user clicks on an option that reads documentation, for instance. And in so doing, we'll actually set the set visible to true in this particular case. So the show window operation on this particular frame will actually just make it visible. And we can implement the corresponding hide window, even though we won't necessarily be using in this case. We won't be using it because the close button that typically renders on the frame itself, its default operation is to hide it. So we won't actually have to link this into anything, but we're just going to throw that method in there just in case we might need to explicitly hide it in the future. Okay? So right now our additional class, the help dialog, is finished. All right, and now we're going to move on to our UI. Now in the UI, there are a couple of things that we need to do first. The first of which is, remember the last time there was this repetition that you see here, the text editor event listener. We're going to make a slight modification whereby we make it a bit more efficient. This is sort of a bad example, and the last time we did it, you know, just to get through the exercise. But an optimized version of this would be to instantiate this particular class, the text editor events listener, instantiate that class once, and use the reference over and over again. So this is what we're going to do first to make that modification. So we're going to turn that into a named reference such as EditorListener, but we're going to create that later on. We're going to do the same thing up here, EditorListener, same reference. All right. So next we head up to the top of our constructor, and like the comment says, you know, we're going to just turn it into one instance of the text editor event listener, and we just do something like this. Okay. So in this particular case, there is going to be one instance of our text editor event listener, not multiple instances every single time you want to attach a listener to a particular component. So this reference editor listener here will be linked here and here, but it's the same instance, which means that we're lighter on resources, etc. Okay, so this is the recommended approach. So this is just a slight modification, a sidebar, as we refine our text editor itself. Now into the main thing. Right now we're going to be focused on linking our help dialog into our main UI. One of the first things that we need to do is add a new menu system. Now currently the menu in our existing version, the menu help doesn't exist. So we're gonna have to actually create that. So we're gonna do that in a bit. All right. But we're gonna still move ahead and declare our help dialog that we created earlier. All right, so we're just gonna make that global. We just want one instance of that, as a matter of fact. So we keep that instance global there. All right, and here is actually where we're gonna instantiate our help dialog. So we start a try statement. Like I mentioned, we need to do this because we're using the URL class, which actually references our HTML help documentation, and it may not necessarily be found. It may be a corrupt type of URL that's being fed to it. In that case, in those particular scenarios, we want to handle the error gracefully. So in this case, we're going to use the try catch statement. All right. So we're going to try to instantiate the help dialog in this case. We're going to catch the couple of exceptions that were previously thrown, the first of which was the malformed URL exception here, all right, and the second of which was the IO exception. So this first catch takes care of catching the malformed URL exception, and we can simply report, the path is wrong, or the URL is malformed or something to that effect. But I'll leave the particular reporting for another time. We won't actually handle that yet, because later on we'll be working on an actual dialog to report any errors and so on. So we'll actually leave that for then. And the second exception that's going to be caught is the IO exception. Again, we're going to just comment that out, and we're going to take care of implementing the actual body of that catch statement later on. So these are the two things that are mandatory when we actually instantiate our help dialog, because of the fact that we're using a URL inside of it, a URL class itself inside of it, and the resource that it points to may not be there, or the URL itself might be malformed. So we have to cater to those two particular scenarios. So once we have this set up, our help dialog is in place, and we need to, like I mentioned, extend our UI, our main UI, to accommodate the documentation menu item. So we're going to create an entirely new menu system, a help menu, and add it to the frame. And it's much of what you did earlier when we were setting up the UI. So we're going to instantiate a new J menu just before your tab pane class comes in, just at the end of all of the code that deals with the menu system. So we're going to instantiate our help menu, call it help, and we're going to add that to the menu bar. And the first menu item here is a documentation menu item. So we're going to call it documentation menu item and label it documentation. And then we're going to add it to our help menu that we just created. And then we're going to build just throw in another item so it doesn't look odd. So you're going to throw another item in a menu item, call it about, for instance, where you can just show information about who created the particular application, for that matter. And you're going to add it to the menu item. So once this is in place, our menu system is actually available. Like I mentioned, like I showed you earlier, it'll look like this up here, with help here, documentation, and about. Okay? And what we need to do next is we need to set up a listener so that it will trigger that particular help dialog that we created earlier. But since we're using a common text editor event listener, that same reference that we threw up there, we are going to preemptively register against that. All right. So we're going to do documentation menu item dot add action listener editor listener, which is the same reference that we created up earlier. Alright, so editor listener is the same common reference that these two are relying upon, that we sort of optimized by creating a single instance here earlier. And if you can recall that the editor listener is of type text editor event listener, which is our subclass, all the way down here. Okay, this is our subclass here that handles all of the events. Okay, and sets up all of the various conditions and interprets all of the various incoming events that will be directed to the buttons that we registered earlier. Alright, so once we have this set up, the next natural step would be for us to make some slight adjustments to our listener. Okay, so the adjustment that we'll make to our listener is the addition of a documentation condition. Now this here needs to be added simply because we're catering to the documentation menu item as well, in addition to what was there before. And we want that whenever the user clicks on documentation, that documentation menu item, we call the HelpDialog's show window method. So you see how it's all coming together now? So the HelpDialog instance that we instantiated earlier on in this particular class will have within it, if you remember, a couple of methods down here called show window and hide window. We're actually forcing the visibility to be true whenever the user clicks on the documentation menu item, which is what we want. Alright, so once that's in place, our modifications are complete, and if you compile and everything is working, make sure you fix your imports as needed. If everything is working, then you can access your help, click on your documentation, and this window will pop up. You'll notice that, like I mentioned, the window itself, it exists, but it's not visible. It only becomes visible once you click on this. And the unique thing about that is that it will not spawn multiple instances of it, simply because we're just setting the visibility to true every single time. So every single time that happens, it basically pulls up the same instance. If we click here, it will set visibility to false naturally, because that's the natural behavior, the default behavior of that close button on any operating system. If you do documentation again, it will show it once again. Alright, so that's it. Next time we'll continue with some more modifications on our text editor.